Good evening, everyone. My name is Carolyn Brown, and I'm the Senior Associate Director of Development and Community Engagement at Penn Medicine's Bassler Center. On behalf of the Bassler Center, I would like to welcome you to tonight's discussion with Bassler Young Leadership Council co-chair Erika Stallings for a conversation with BRCA mutation carrier and advocate Taylor Harris, author of This Boy We Made, a memoir of motherhood, genetics, and facing the unknown. The opinions and experiences shared tonight are the panelists' own and do not represent those of the Bassler Center or Penn Medicine. You should consult with your healthcare team should you have any questions about the specifics of your health and medical plan. Thank you to Erika and Taylor for joining us this evening for this important discussion about navigating health and education systems as Black women and a Black mother. Erika Stallings is an attorney based in New York City. She currently works as an assistant general counsel at Facebook. She is also a freelance writer and has been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, O Magazine, The Cut, and many other venues. In July 2014, she learned that she carries a BRCA2 mutation and underwent a preventative mastectomy in December 2014 to lower her risk of developing breast cancer. Erika is passionate about the mission of the Bassler Center and strives to educate other young women and men about hereditary cancer so that more individuals are empowered to be proactive about reducing their risk for BRCA-related cancers. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Erika.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Carolyn. I'd like to get the evening started by introducing Taylor Harris, as well as thanking her for generously offering her time to this event this evening. Taylor is a writer, wife, and mom of three who lives in Pennsylvania. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Time, O Quarterly, the Washington Post, Long Reads, The Cut, Romper, Parents, McSweeney's, and other publications. In January of 2022, Taylor published This Boy We Made, a memoir of motherhood, genetics, and facing the unknown, which will form the basis of our discussion this evening. I just want to also lay out a little bit of an outline for the evening. Taylor will start by reading an excerpt from her book. We will have a discussion based on some questions that I put together, and then we will leave some time for Q&A at the end. You can put those questions directly into the chat. And with that, I will turn it over to Taylor.
Thank you so much, Erika, and thank you to the Bassler Center and everyone who has taken time to listen in tonight. I'm going to read just about a 5-minute excerpt from my memoir. And I think all you need to know is that this is sort of the scene where I get my first breast MRI. I have finished nursing my youngest child, and so I can finally get it. And you will hear probably some mentions of anxiety in this. I've had an anxiety disorder since I was a teenager, and so that also sort of plays into how I experience this MRI. I drove 10 minutes to the medical building and tried to forget the hospice sign I passed on the way in. If I didn't see it, it didn't. If I didn't touch it, it didn't exist. There weren't dying people floors above me, no lady in a wheelchair along the side of the building smoking one of her last cigarettes. Miriam, blonde and petite in black scrubs, led me from the waiting area after I'd changed clothes. I was all too happy to leave behind the woman with glasses who read her book with one continuous frown, and the large guy in jean shorts who was the first man to see me in my MRI getup. Loose beige pants with an open fly and a pink flowery gown with no bra. I doubt anyone had even noticed, but I prepared a mental apology for someone I might encounter concerned with the location of my boobs. I swear they weren't always due south. But Miriam had probably imaged 1,000 breasts, and she moved easily, sliding my locker key onto her wrist and pointing to a trash can for my gum. Yellow and black signs, warning of radiation or magnetization or scary things I did not stop to ponder, were plastered on wide wooden doors, and I followed her past a cluster of computers and employees through the door straight ahead. I tried not to notice. I tried to do, not think. If I thought too hard about the thick-walled MRI tunnel, the table sticking out like a tongue, the IV in my right arm, the hard silver bar that would kiss my sternum for the next 30 minutes as I lie face down, or the hospice above where no one could prevent death, I would regret not taking the Ativan my friend had suggested. If anyone should pop an extra anti-anxiety pill before a medical procedure, it should be me. Yet I've lived with my irrational fear so long, sometimes I think I can control it, charm it quiet like a snake.
Thank you so much. And I have to tell you before we get started, I read your book, like I reread it on the plane on Monday, and I read it a couple times before then to prepare for this. But I still thought when you said an artist named Travis, I thought you were about to say Travis Scott, because I think if I were having an MRI, like I would need some hip hop.
Completely different experience.
It's a very different experience. To start off, I've like followed your writing for a long time. I remember when you had an essay in The Cut, which we're going to talk about later, about your like thoughts around like having a preventive mastectomy. And I remember like being really excited to be like, oh my God, here's another Black woman who's dealing with this issue that I'm dealing with. But you also had a column that you had for Catapult, where you wrote about the medical challenges that your son was and is currently going through. And as someone who is also marrying a writer, I know that committing to writing a book is a very massive undertaking. So really, like, what made you decide that like this story, like both like your sons and yourselves, was like something that you wanted to put out into the world?
I'm so glad you didn't ask me like, Taylor, should I get married to a writer? I thought that was coming. This I can answer. But basically, you're right. I'd written about my son, and I'd sort of like, I write, like we all know, I think Didion said to kind of figure out what I'm thinking. And that's been so true for me. So I sort of write through things, take some time, look back. And so I knew I wanted to write about my son. And then there was this question of like, is it enough? Like, is that enough for a book? And it might have been, but I remember still the morning I got some results back, like soon after I found out I was BRCA2 positive. And I was in like this little cafe in Charlottesville, this like French cafe. And it wasn't like a magical moment because it had to do with finding out that I carried the mutation and that I had to make another appointment to see another specialist. But it was this moment where I remember thinking like, I think this story has enough. Like, I think it can go deep enough. I think it can cover enough. I think it's got roots. And I think it's worth telling. And I wish I could tell you what exactly when that was. It was, probably 2015 or 2016. So years after that, right? Fast forward, I guess, like 6 years until the book comes out. So it was definitely a long process, but I think I knew I wanted to write about like how this child comes from my body and then tells me something about my own body.
Yeah. And, coming back to that for a second, talking about your learning that you had a BRCA mutation, I think for myself and a lot of people who are probably tuning in this evening, we undergo genetic testing because, we have a parent or a relative, and like our sort of frame of reference is like, we have this 50-50 chance and like going into the appointment. Whereas like, the circumstances under which you learn are a little bit different. Your son had undergone this full genomic testing, and you find out as a consequence of that like you and him are carriers. And I guess I just wanted to like hear a little bit about like what that was like. But then also like before you got the news from the geneticist, was BRCA mutations was something you were familiar with, or had you ever thought about like the family history of cancer in your family?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I was totally shocked when I got the news. I was expecting to hear like some sort of mutation that would answer like why my son had developmental delays, why he was slow to gain weight or grow, even to the point of growth failure, why his blood sugar dropped to 27 one day. And instead, the only sure sort of mutation that the geneticist knew would be clinically relevant was the BRCA mutation. And so to answer your second part, your question, basically I grew up in Bexley, Ohio. And when I was in middle school, I was best friends with a woman, then a girl named Lindsay Abner. Like we had sleepovers. She'd go away for summer camp for 8 weeks, and we would just like cry, like I can't wait till you get back. And so it's just so interesting. As you may know, Lindsay started Bright Pink. She had a preventive mastectomy when she was in her 20s. And so I knew about BRCA through Lindsay. I knew her mom and her grandmother and probably other women in her family had cancer, and that it was a really big deal. But when you look at my family tree, there's a lot of cancer on my mom's side, but it's just like all different kinds. And then there was also the question like, well, if they had lung cancer and they smoked, or if they had cancer in their liver and they were a heavy drinker, like, does that apply to us? If we don't do those things. And so nobody looking at my family tree would have been like, yeah, we should get you tested. And so, I mean, it really still hits me to think back to, I would edit some of Lindsay's materials for Bright Pink. And I remember taking like the 5-minute quiz of like, are you at risk? And I remember taking it and being like, no, like I still might get cancer because it's like all on my mom's side, but like I'm not worried about this,
Yeah. So you learn, and correct me if the timeline is wrong, but your son undergoes the full genomic testing, and as a result, you learn in 2016 that you have the mutation. And you ultimately made the decision to undergo a preventative mastectomy last year during the pandemic. And as I mentioned, when you first came on my radar back in 2017, you had wrote this really great piece for The Cut where you were wondering about like kind of weighing the decision to have a mastectomy and whether it was like something you should do for your children's sake, and what do you do when something is not certain but the odds are really high. And so, just kind of what led you to make that decision to say, okay, like this is actually the right time, or this is the right thing to do?
So what the great people who've joined us tonight, what you might not know if you haven't read the book is that I found out, so going back to, it was the end of 2015 when I found out. It was like the Monday after Thanksgiving. We'd just gotten back in town, and it didn't make a lot of sense, but I really felt that I might need a pregnancy test. It was very early on. I'd been off birth control for like less than a month. My husband was scheduled to have a vasectomy, let's just be honest. And so just the chance was so small, but I end up buying like a $10 test from Target and taking it. And like I sit and I wait and nothing happens. And then like at the very tail end of that time window, something starts crawling across. And I really couldn't believe it. And also I absolutely knew that I was pregnant. And so it's 5 hours later, I'm pregnant with my third. We had said we were done. And it's 5 hours later that I get that call. Sorry, Erika, what was your original question? I'm getting caught up in how weird that day was.
No, I was gonna make a Jurassic Park joke, and I was gonna say like life finds a way, right? But no, I mean, so right. So sorry, I'm letting myself being distracted. I just wanted to kind of talk about like what led you to finally make the genetic surgery. And one of the reasons I'm curious is because, which like we'll talk about later, like one of the things I was like most struck by in a really beautiful way in your book is like the role that like religion and faith like plays in your life. And so, just like kind of talking about like what were the factors like kind of that led you to say, okay, like this is the time, the surgery is like the right thing for me.
Yeah. So sorry, the way I ended up on the baby story is that I knew, first of all, obviously I wanted to have my last baby who was a girl. And so that just takes a while, right? You're 9 months. I'm sick the whole time, basically, when I have kids. And so I needed to get through that. I wanted to nurse her, and so I get through all of that. I have whatever testing I can have done, but again, I couldn't have the breast MRI. I started getting the breast MRI. I think for one thing that probably benign, the little mass that they found that was one, you know, little flag of like, I do not want to wait for these emails again. And then I did decide, we'll talk a little bit about faith, I know, but I did decide to like pray and even fast a little bit. I am not great at fasting. I am not your Moses. I miss lunch and my head's like exploding. But I did like fast a little bit and just try to really like hear like what should I do and when. And then something else that sort of pushed me over the edge was there was this piece in the New York Times by Elizabeth Wurtzel, and she died. She ended up dying of cancer, and she had written a piece though years before about her you know, what it was like to have cancer, and that she wished she would have gotten tested for the BRCA mutation. She felt like any woman, like especially of Jewish descent, like who might have it, should just go ahead. And she mentioned this thing in her piece that she said basically like cancer, like it's not just painful, it's boring. She was like, it's waiting and it's staying in waiting rooms and reading like the same old copy of Golf Digest. And I'm just so sad about what happened. And I'm so thankful she decided to write that, because that, I don't know why, but that was the truth that hit me. Like, I'm sure there were many more horrifying things she endured, but just talking about like cancer being boring in some spaces, I was just like, for whatever reason, I was like, I don't think I can handle that. And so I think those things sort of all came together. And then, you know, who knew? I walk in, I see my breast surgeon, who I sort of like am obsessed with, and she has got great style. And I'm like, if somebody's going to do this, it's going to be you. I trust you, because look at your shoes. She's got great shoes. And I finally go tell her, and then we like, you know, we get something on the calendar, I think for April, and then the world, you know, the pandemic comes. And so it gets pushed back to that summer.
Got it. No, I will tell you, I saw my gynecologic oncologist yesterday, and I feel the same way. Like, she only wears, like, she's very fabulous. She always has on like a really nice shift dress. Like yesterday it was Elitari. She always wears like Manolos. And the person who gave me her name was like, you know, she's really fabulous. And I was like, yes, that's exactly what I'm looking for, right? Like, if someone has to be taking photos of my ovaries like every 6 months, like at least they can be like a very like well-dressed person.
Yeah, I need goals, you know. I might shop at Target, but I need to know at least what the cool people are doing and wearing. So
yeah. So, and this kind of disconnects, you know, to the fact when you learn that you have the mutation, you're pregnant with your third child. Mm. And so I know that you have 3 children who are all still relatively young. But have you thought about it all? Well, I guess 2 questions. Mm-hmm. Have you talked about like, you know, BRCA or cancer with them at all? And in either way, like, have you thought about like when they get older, like what that conversation with them might be like around like testing and choices?
Yeah, so this is really like a shift for me. So this started with, there's this baby, I think possibly, that is in me very early on, and I didn't even get a chance to say like, no, maybe I won't try to conceive now that I know that I have this, or maybe we'll do some sort of, I know there's more fancy technology and testing out there that I don't even know about with testing before. I just sort of felt, I went from like, oh my gosh, I really feel like this is a girl. It was a girl. And she, you know, I say in the book, like, she hasn't even developed these body parts that will one day maybe need to be tested. I couldn't really wrap my mind around that. And I think I'm shifting now. My oldest is 11. And I think we all can recognize like which time in development that is. And so that's different. That's hard. Like, it's coming closer. It used to be sort of a far off, almost abstract burden of like, hey, I know those are conversations that are going to be hard and that I don't really want to have. And now it's like, oh, like her body is shifting. Like, when? So the short answer is no, I haven't yet. And what is partly complicated is because like I had time to enjoy or not enjoy parts of my body, right? sure, I had insecurities, but like my breasts were mine, you know, I don't, there's nothing she can do right now. And so I hesitate to share with her something where she'll just think about it for another, 7-ish years. That said, I do at some point want to share with them sort of what was all that about with mommy and these surgeries, you know?
Yeah. Well, to switch topics for a second, like one of the things about your book that I really appreciate, or because you like very skillfully weave it throughout, is the way that race impacts the interactions you're having within the medical system for both yourself and your son, but also in the education system when you're trying to obtain services for him. And I when I was rereading to prepare for this, like I got upset again on your behalf. Like I'm sure I'm not as upset as you were. Like there's a scene in your book where you're talking to the IEP team, and they tell you like he can only have 3 days of services, right? Even though you're like, well, he gets 5 somewhere else, and he's actually doing really well. So like, why would you cut the services? And they say like, well, in this county we do it differently, right? Which is such like a telltale and a dog whistle and a whole bunch of other things. And you know, and you also talk about the fact that like when you go into these rooms, which I think is something that a lot of Black people can relate to, both in medical settings, educational settings, and professional settings, is that like you don't have the luxury of just like getting to be an individual, right? You're not just advocating for your son. You have to, in some ways, carry that weight of advocating for all Black children or our Black patients. And so the questions I wanted to ask you are two. The first is, you know, I you tell me if I'm wrong. I think that despite the challenges, like both the ones that you've experienced personally, and then I think the ones that we know as Black people exist, you never seemingly lose your faith in the fact that like in the medical system, right? Like you keep going, you and Paul are still like trying to find the answers. You're like still doing the IEP thing. And so I guess my first question is just like how, like given all that weight and all the challenges, like how did you maintain that? Because I think it's hard.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think on the educational side, really on both sides, it helped to know that we could find people who could help us. So I think what's really great is that we had some champions early on. So especially on the educational side, we had his first preschool class that was like a special education preschool class, you know, kids with various disabilities or delays. That teacher, Paige, I actually named her in the book, is still in Charlottesville. And she was just down for the cause, right? Like didn't pretend to know every single thing, but was ready to listen, was ready to shift or change the IEP if we wanted, was ready to, you know, she was the kind of teacher who said, he seems to look for some sort of like stimulation. Like what if we swing him around in this chair? And then I ask him questions like, I think the information is in there. My job as a teacher is to get it out of him. And so she was willing to play and try to figure out. That said, like it's become harder, especially during the pandemic, to sort of say what a teacher or educator should be. Because I'm like, I don't know how they're showing up right now. And I don't think every teacher has to be a Paige. But because we had her early on, when we did find somebody where it felt like you were running into a brick wall and they were just like, no, we can't do this. We were like, no, actually, we know it's possible. And it's been really good for us. And so we're not going to sign this document until we get that. Also on the medical side, there were definitely like mistakes made. You know, I point out the thing about how his urine sample was lost, and you know, that wasn't the biggest part of it for me, because I'm like, people are people and mistakes are made, and it didn't cost him his life. But it was the fact that nobody really just led with, you know what, I'm sorry, that was an important sample. It took a long time for us to get it from his diaper. And we apologize deeply. We lost it. I know we can't get it back. You know, just something like that, but sort of skipping over it, to me says like, maybe there is a lack of respect. Like when you look at me, you look at my husband, you know, what do you see? And if you were like a white professor, or I were a white professor in the business school, like, would you have felt okay, you know, sort of skimming over what was lost? So it is hard, but I think, you know, I didn't really have a lot of other choices. We had seen that it could work well early on. And then I think, you know, my encouragement would be for people to, it's really easy. You've probably heard this too, Erika, but just like trust Black people, believe Black people, right? Like trust Black women and believe Black women. That's what I think when I sort of enter those spaces where I'm not sure if my story holds any weight, you know?
Yeah. Well, that sort of leads into my second question on this topic, because, you know, I think because of, you know, your own experience and also like navigating your child through this, like you've seen probably both like the best, but also the worst parts of, you know, the medical system and, you know, the special education system. And, you know, if you had a magic wand, I mean, I'm sure there's many things you would do if you had a magic wand, but if you had a magic wand, like what would be the ways or the things that you would want to see differently in those systems?
Yeah, so I'll tell you what I do know of, and then I'll leave it to the people who, like, I've got friends who work really in health equity and things that could like map out, they really could wave the magic wand and map that out. I can tell you what I've seen is that very similar stories coming out of the hospital we visited, where like if two Black males on two different occasions came in with really troubling symptoms, and the questions they were asked only revolved around drug use, and they didn't use drugs. You know what I'm saying? Something that is all too common. A study came out of the same medical school there about, you know, these are students who want to be doctors and who were polled to say that they believe Black people feel less pain. And so just things that where Erika, you and I might be like, that's ridiculous, that's not true. And it's like, these are people studying to be doctors, and these are their beliefs. And so I'm not great at sort of the part of like, here's the blueprint for doing it, but I know that it needs to happen. It needs to be more than just like a DEI sort of like, we're gonna have this like brown bag again, you know, like those are important. But also like I'm sort of past the point where when people are like, I want to change, I just don't know what to do. I'm sort of like there's just so many good books. You know, I beat myself up for like, I just grabbed Dr. Imani Perry's South to America to read, like, and I was American Studies major, and I just never feel like I can really know enough. And so I think where I am on that is like, I don't know the blueprint, but there's just so much information that at this point, I don't think we have an excuse not to know. And I don't think it should be only on, you know, people that look like you and me to always sort of be the educators, you know?
Yeah, no, it's interesting, you know, because a lot of times, I mean, I'm sure this happened to you too, like during the summer of 2020, like all of a sudden, like people at my job were like, Erika, like, you know, like what can we do? Like, how can we make it better? And my answers, and it was interesting because of the pandemic, you know, my fiance was like, basically he was like sitting on the couch and I'm sitting in my office.
Yeah.
And he was like, he was like, I'm frustrated on your behalf because he's like, your boss keeps asking you like what to do. And you're like, hire more Black lawyers. And your company's basically like, well, we're not going to do that. So just give us like, so yeah, we're not doing that. So just like come up with something else. Right. And I'm like, no, like the solution is really simple. Just hire more Black people and treat them well. But that like completely goes over people's head.
Right. And like hire them and then like find out how to keep them, right? Like I find that in academia, the other side, it's like, yes, bring them in and then don't let them leave,
Yeah. I always, I say people, what do you think is applicable in like, medicine and education and academia, which is like, you have to bring Black people in and you have to like treat them the way you treat white people. And I think that gets complicated because then of course the person who hears that is like, well, of course I treat everyone the same, right? And it's like, oh, well, maybe you don't.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and sometimes people, I don't know if you've gotten this question, but I feel like I've been asked like, sort of how important are Black doctors, or like, should you only go to Black doctors? And for me, like I said, my fashionable breast surgeon is not a Black woman. But I knew right away, maybe because she was a mother, I don't know, I could trust her for whatever reasons, whatever I was picking up from, and also I feel like she's a person where if I came to her with a question about being Black and having the mutation and she didn't know an answer, that she would either find it or find someone who did. And the other thing I do is just have like a lot of Black doctor friends on speed dial where if something goes down, I can always check in with them.
Yeah, I was gonna say, one for the audience who maybe have not had a chance to read Taylor's book, which you should order, it's very good. The opening chapters are about the first time her son has an issue with his blood sugar, and they take him to the hospital and they lose the urine sample. But the other thing I remember from the story is you talk about like how one of your husband's colleagues like called you and said like, remind them, that like you're a professor, like remind them that you are white collar people. And I'm, to your point about like having Black doctor friends on speed dial, it's something, I think about, I'm sure you've thought about a lot, right? Like there's like class privilege and then there's like medical privilege. And I often think about like what my own experiences be like, if I didn't have friends who I know like can tell me like the questions to ask, or, if I didn't like, work at a company that like affords me like a lot of like health insurance and time off and all these other things, right? So I guess I just say that to say is, there's so many like layers to unpack like around this stuff.
Yeah, no, that's a great point.
Well, on a maybe not like lighter topic, but maybe like a more pleasant topic, I have a couple more questions before we do Q&A. I said this in the beginning, like I grew up like in the South. I grew up in like a Presbyterian household. But I think as an adult, I've sometimes struggled as like what does like religion and faith, like what role does that play in my life? But some of the parts of your book where I was like most touched on is like when you talk about like your faith and your religion, and you mentioned you prayed and you fast before you made the decision to have a preventative mastectomy. But I just wanted to like hear a little bit more just about like the role that faith has played in helping you manage like your own health challenges as well as the situation with your son.
Yeah, I mean, I think I really came to faith more so in college. Like I was sort of raised Catholic and, sort of knew like what I considered right and wrong or what I should do. So I had some sort of background knowledge. But really, really paid more attention in college, I guess. And then it became this thing of like, for those who might not know, I have a generalized anxiety disorder. And so that's something that I knew that I had pretty early on as a teenager. And it became this thing where like college was so great and I was involved in ministry and I was on my meds and like I felt sort of invincible. And I think somewhere thought that like, having faith meant that like I didn't need meds or that I could sort of like either get rid of my anxiety or like make it really, really small, like make it really not matter. And so I think what I've really shifted away, I think I've shifted away from that in my faith. And I've asked this question, I think my son Tophs, because we don't have a diagnosis, I've been forced into like, what if like faith is not about getting rid of all the things? Like for me, what if it's like inviting, Jesus to sit with me? Like, what if it's believing that, so you hear like, if you have the faith of a mustard seed, like you can move mountains sort of a thing. And like, that is great. But also like, what if it means like he's big enough just to like sit with me in this, and is that enough? And so I'm really working more in that direction now. So for me, like, that's comforting, but it's also really hard because it doesn't fit well into that sort of idea I think I almost subconsciously carried with me, that like if I do the right things and like I'll be good, like, you know, like if I read my Bible, if I pray, if I go to church, if I'm like basically okay to other people, that like I'll be safe. And I think it depends on how you define safety, because obviously we all die at some point, and that doesn't feel very safe to me in some ways. And so I think, yeah, it's just been sort of coming back to what my assumptions were. And I'm thankful, you know, I'm thankful to be Toph's mom, and how this has helped me to reconsider, because Toph's doesn't really have these problems like with his theology. Toph's just like, he's like very happy to pray, you know, and just like ask questions. Like he asked, like if he dies and basically like meets Jesus, like will he still be black? He has these questions that somehow I never thought of, and it's like this other theology doesn't get in the way, and I think I love that about kids.
Yeah. Well, two things. For those of you in the audience, we do have time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please put those into the chat. And I will say before I ask my last couple questions, there's like a scene. I don't remember what the question was, but like you asked Toph something. Hold on, did I say it right? Toph's.
Oh, we say Toph's.
Toph's. You ask him something, and then I can't remember if he doesn't respond, but then your daughter is like, "Mommy, the information just like goes into his brain," and you're just like, "Oh, like I'm so struck by like how wise children can be in these situations."
Yeah, like it's not like, I feel like it was like a subtle like, Mom, it's not about you and your like theology, like you got it, it'll be okay. But yeah, it points to like, yes, how in tune they can be with things, you know, and in each other. She was like, chill out, like he's got it, you know.
Yeah. Well, I will say the answer to your question kind of anticipated my last question, which I read it. You did a either an interview or a panel with Lynn Strager. I can't remember.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things she asked you about, which I was also struck by, is that, you know, normally when you tell a story or you read a book, right, you go on the journey, and then like the end, there's like this really nice, like kind of tidy or happy ending, right? And naturally, you know, the happy ending here would be like knowing like what the answer to this medical mystery is.
Yeah.
But that's not the case. And for people who have not had a chance to read the book, when the book ends, the doctors still don't know like what causes Toph's problems. And so, you know, really my question for you is like, how do you, well, actually, I know what I wanted to ask you, because sorry. No. Because I think it's something, the reason I want to touch on this, because I think it's something that a lot of BRCA mutation carriers can relate to, right? Like you're told that you have this disorder that has a really high risk of cancer, but we don't know if you're going to get cancer. And then when you talk about all the ovarian cancer stuff, it always feels like this moving target of like, yeah, maybe it's in the tubes. Or, oh, you need to have your ovaries taken out. We don't really have good screenings for you, right? And so I think to live with BRCA is to live in a lack of clarity. Yeah. So I guess I just wanted for you to share with the audience like how you have navigated that over the past few years.
Well, I'll start out with a quick, funny story, but my agent reached out to some people who produce movies, and you know, that's what happens when you write a book. Like you see if like somehow somebody really famous wants to play you. I had high hopes, like, but anyway, they wrote back and they were like, this is beautifully written, we love this story, the only thing is like we could really use a diagnosis at the ending. And I was like, me too. So to your point, like it's not me. And I think what happened with this book is like I really did want to tell the narrative. Like I wanted the tension of, you do follow us on this medical mystery and this sort of journey of motherhood. And I think it's a place, like, when people ask what I wanted this book to be, one, I wanted to read as a love letter to Toast one day when I feel like he's old enough to read it and understand it. But also I wanted it, you know, a lot of people ask, like, what do you want people to take away? And I think you can take away like 100 different things. It depends on where you are. But I really wanted to be a place where people could just like sort of take a seat and like sit with all of this and bring whatever they need to bring to the book. And feel like this was a space where they could rest, and not like where you rest and you get up and like all your problems have disappeared, because that just doesn't happen. But I feel like it's a space like you can just take it all in and sit with it. And I think that's sort of my approach, right? And I think you're right. People with BRCA mutations live that way. I think, right, all of us are sort of feeling that with the pandemic a little bit, like we thought this would be lifted and then it wasn't, or we thought this surge was over, you know, and then it's just like, you know, sort of what are plans anymore. And I feel like that was really brought to bear with Toast's situation. And then, you know, women and men like us who carry the mutation. And so there's no easy answer, but I think it's helpful just to have space. Even when you were just mentioning like what you hear when you go about your ovaries, like just coming from your mouth to my ears, like to me, that was comforting. I'm like, you know, my mind's telling me that like, you're not alone, right? Like there's someone else right here who has been in those same appointments.
Yeah. Well, this was such a good conversation. I do want to make sure I have some. We have a couple questions from the audience, and if we have time, I have a couple other things that I thought of. Okay. But the first question I have that was submitted by one of our attendees is, as a writer, did you know you were going to write about the experiences in your book as you lived it? And did this shift how you experiences the difficulties and or how you journaled and took notes? Mm-hmm. Asking because I am an aspiring BRCA memoirist.
Well, that is fantastic. I'm here to cheer on all the writers and the lawyers too, Erika. Yeah. But seriously, I have thought about this question because some people have like strict writing routines. I'm not as great about that, and I don't journal like every day. I get sort of bored with my thoughts and like having to write them all out. But I do sometimes write notes down. You know, we've got the notes section in our iPhones that can be my place. Or sometimes I would take notes after those appointments, especially when I was first gathering a lot of information. And so I do always have like a journal around, and I would also like request medical records. So I did a lot of research in that sense. And looked at things from, you know, gosh, I even found like an old high school newspaper that I had written in. Wow. That was harsh. But I think that what I want to say overall is like not to worry. I think sometimes you feel like, oh my gosh, like, am I missing things? Like, do I need to be writing more things down? And I would say like, if it strikes you, write it down somewhere. I also have like a dry erase wall that you can't see. I turned it because my handwriting is out of control. But that's also a place where I can just jot down ideas. And for me, that works. If you like journaling every day, then you'll be set. But for me, it's like, I can't beat myself up over not like doing baby books and having all the journals. I missed that boat. But I think chances are you have enough material or can find enough material to say what you need to say.
Yeah. You know, I will say a friend of mine, Hanif Abdurraqib, talks about like maybe thinking about a book as like, you know, he wrote like, I remember he wrote like a book about a tribe called Quest. He talked about like, I think it was like 90,000 words, 100,000 words. And so he was just like, okay, like I just have to write 10,000 words 10 times. Like, wow. Like thinking about like in those kind of chunks. Yeah. So I have not written a book. Taylor has, but I just say that because I don't know if that like helps.
I didn't know you were friends with him. He's in Columbus, right?
Yeah, I mean through my fiance. Like I kind of feel like there's like a mini I feel like I'm getting very off topic. There's like this kind of like Harlem Renaissance of like Black writers who are all friends. Yeah. And like came up at the same time. Also very like Clint cool. Smith, there's like a friend of ours, like Eve Ewing. Eve Ewing actually is the person who introduced me to my fiance. Wow. Yeah. So anyway, I promise I'll come back. But I had before when we got engaged, I told my fiance, I was like, we should just charge. We know we're gonna invite all these writers, and we should just charge tickets and like have like a poetry reading like at our wedding. Be like in one place you can see like Nate Marshall, Eve Ewing, Clint Smith the third, like
that would be amazing.
Like, Jamila Woods, and just like that how we pay for the wedding. Well, but I do have a last couple questions, but before that, I wanted to read this comment out because I thought it was very sweet. Taylor, I have not read your book yet, although I'd like to, but I did read your recent essay in the New York Times about moving between gratitude and grief after your mastectomy. I shared it with my daughter who just had her surgery last week. I thought it was so powerful and tapped into all the mixed feelings so beautifully. I wanted to give her permission to not only be relieved, but also to be sad.
Yeah, thank you. That I think, I don't know, maybe it's because I'm still so close to it, but even hearing that back brings up a lot of emotions, you know. I think nobody rushed me not to feel sad. It wasn't like I had that sort of pressure, but I think, like I wrote, there are so many people want to cheer you on just so you believe you can do it. And I need all those people because I tend to not believe that I can do these things. So I need the you can do hard things people. And then I'm also thankful that people who know me well enough are like, all right, are you really okay? Are you really doing okay? And then over time, like when I'm ready, you know, I can start to feel and think about what I went through and be thankful, and also say, man, that was a lot on my body.
Yeah. Well, there's actually a question which anticipated one of the questions I wanted to ask you, which was, so how did your family take the news about you carrying the mutation, given that it was a surprise? And you know, without like prying too much, I'm just curious, like, you know, because something I think a lot of people struggle with is like, how do you tell family members? So would love to hear about that.
Yeah, that was hard. I think I told I have two older sisters, so I'm like the baby girl, and sort of your stereotypical baby girl, like very well taken care of by family members. And I think I told my sisters together on the line, and we're like, you can go ahead and tell mom and dad however you want. I can't field questions right now. And so I did have that boundary early on. Like I just knew I couldn't handle that. And my sisters were great because they're just always a sounding board. They're not going to tell me what to do necessarily. They might tell me which way they'd lean or what their thoughts would be, but just super supportive. And then, you know, what was hard is that I knew it probably came from my mom because, like I mentioned, she lost so many family members from cancer. And my dad just has this side where they like all live to be like 98. And it was hard because I think my mom felt some guilt. Like, you know, you can know rationally, like, it's not your fault that I have this. It's not your fault that you have this. But I think there's still something that goes on there. I feel guilty, right, that my kids have it, or at least one does. But anyway, my mom's first reaction was like, what if I bet they made a mistake. And that's so hard, right? Because even as a mom, as I'm thinking through that now, I heard it then as very much like, no, I know this is science, this is true. Don't tell me that, because I need this space to process. But now that I've had some space from it, from initially finding out, I'm just like, man, I sort of get why that was the avenue you took for a while. And then when she got tested, that was no longer like a viable belief. And then you sit with it, right? And I think she definitely lost some sleep, as you know, just as I lost some sleep over it. I think it was a weird feeling that my sisters didn't have it. I didn't want them to. So I hope that comes through very clear. Also, I just assumed out of three of us that at least two of us would. And so that was a different feeling like, oh man, I'm the youngest. Like, sort of, you just have all sorts of thoughts. Like if they had stopped at 2, like it just would have ended. Like it wouldn't have carried on. And obviously I'm glad I'm here. But that was another thing, sort of being part of this super pack of sisters where I always felt invincible with them. And now I'm the one that has this thing that they don't.
Yeah. For better or worse, I'm an only child. So I didn't there are definitely times like I have thought about like, oh, like what would it be like to have a sibling? Yeah. And then if like my sibling had it and we're in it together, my sibling doesn't have it, then like, do they feel guilty? Do I feel guilty? So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One more question that we have, from a patient's perspective, how can academic medicine move the needle on improving access to genetic testing and risk reducing care for understudied populations and people with language barriers?
I am going to stick with what I know, which is believe Black women, believe Black patients. And Erika, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I just feel like if you have anything to add, I know that you have done some more research in this area than I have. I honestly didn't know much about Black and BRCA. It just wasn't on my radar. And then it became sort of, my story mixed in with my son's. And now I'm coming to a place where I'm like, no, I want to know more. Like, why aren't we being offered testing? What's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of feel like, that meme on the internet of the guy who has like the whiteboard with all the red lines and he like he's pointing, it looks like really crazy. Like I feel like that's me when people ask me about this, only because it's like both like a very complicated topic and then it's also like a very, to me, kind of like simple topic. I mean, I feel like part of the challenge, like if you really take a step back and you think about like genetic testing, it's a super complicated topic. Like I think about all the time. I'm a lawyer. I work at a Fortune 50 company. I work, I deal with copyright issues, super complex stuff. And there were times when I was going through the like process of genetic testing and having a mastectomy where I was like, this is so overwhelming. Like I can't, I can't do this. I just like want to tap out. And so I think at like a baseline, they're like really, which I think like some stuff like what Vassar is doing with like Black and BRCA and Latinx and BRCA is there just like has to be that like first step of like introducing genetic testing as like a concept to like minority communities. And that seems so obvious, but I would have never like wrote anything if there had been articles about being a Black woman with BRCA, but they just like didn't exist. Right. And then I think from there, like if anybody who's on this phone call or call is very wealthy and like wants to fund this idea, like something I like am super interested in, but I just like don't have the money to do it. It's like, what if you put genetic counselors like in community settings? Like we know like a lot of minority women or like poor, like people lack insurance or like don't have so much money. Like they get seen at like their Planned Parenthood or like their community clinic, right? And if you have to then go from there to, the academic hospital and travel to see a genetic counselor, like there's so many things that might happen in between like the referral and the trip. But like, what if you just put a genetic counselor like in your Planned Parenthood, like, and then walk across the hall? And it's like, but I also think we need like more Black genetic counselors. And I will say, I will give a special shout out to Penn Medicine because they do have a scholarship program that was started, I think last year, to fully fund, well, like it's basically almost a full scholarship to fund like a diverse candidate to get their master's degree in genetic counseling.
Oh, I do like that. Yes, that could be, yes. At every school, right? That could, I know there aren't that many genetic counseling programs anyway, right? Across the country. It seems like a pretty special field. Like, that's great to know.
Yeah, only it's either 1% or less than 1% of genetic counselors are Black, right? So it's like one of those things that's like, there's a lot of work to be done, but it's also like kind of like a really, like to your point about just like doing the work, there's like a really ripe target that's like right there. Yeah.
And just something small to add. We saw a Black geneticist at CHOP a woman, and you know, she couldn't wave her magic wand and tell us what was going on, but there was something about sort of the care that she had for him and the way that she looked for him and pictures that she took of things that I had questions about. Like there was a newness she brought to it of like, okay, you know, I know you guys have seen everybody, let me take a fresh look. And just so back to that question of like how much the black doctors matter. And, you know, and my statement of believing and trusting our stories, I think is still really important.
Yeah. Well, one thing, and I know we're almost at time, and I would be curious because I know when your son underwent the genetic testing, he got like a variant of, jump in if I'm saying anything wrong. He got a variant of unknown significance, so that they knew something was wrong, but that they couldn't really tell you. It wasn't actionable, and like is. You know, the point I wanted to make is that often, like, because Black individuals are not in these genetic testing databases at the same rate of European individuals, like Black individuals are more likely to get a variant of unknown significance, like what they refer to as like a VUS. And so I was just curious, like it was my last question, like did they ever tell you that, like, you know, they might know more if you all were white?
No, but you are blowing my mind with 1 minute left. How are you gonna wait until 8 o'clock to drop this? Now I'll be going to buy more books to read or research articles. I had not made, I mean, that's what I mean. I sort of came to this with my story, knowing I'm viewed a certain way in some places as a Black woman, but there's not a lot of digging I've done. And so that's that first connection I've made. So that's helpful to me.
Yeah. No, and like, you know, and then we really will wrap up. I thought about it because I can't remember the name of the disease. It's this disease in the movie Lorenzo's Oil. It's like this very rare, like this disorder. And I had one day I had lunch with this person who like works in the music industry, and I like assumed like she's Black woman, I'm a Black woman. Probably just like wants to talk about like being a Black woman in the music industry. And she tells me, she's like, no, actually, like I reached out to you because my son has this really rare disorder. And like none of the treatments they have, like it's rare, and then it's even more rare to have as a Black person. So like even the few treatments that they have developed, like they don't have any data about like how they work in Black people. And it's just like really hard, and like I feel really alone, and like seeing things that you like have written on the internet, right? And so this is actually like a good point to sum up. Like I think one of the reasons your book is so important is because, you know, I think to have like a BRCA mutation or even any type of rare disease is like a very isolating process. But then when you like layer race on top of that, it's like an isolation, like in an isolation. So I just want to say, like, as I close out, like, thank you for your work. Thank you for your writing. Like, thank you for sharing your story with us, and for sharing your son's story. And thank you to the Bassler Center for hosting this and providing the space as always.
Thank you.